Hello guys, it's Mr. Schmitz here. We are getting started with our last unit of the year, and that last unit being ecology. So what I wanted to do today with you guys was just introduce the overall concepts in ecology and sort of give you an introduction into some of those overarching themes. So what is ecology? I've obviously got in the background a picture of some undergrowth in a forest, so you can see behind there you've got trees and leaves, and then you've got undergrowth on some rocks here in the front. So ecology is going to be the study of the interdependence between and among organisms. What does that mean? The study of interdependence. So we're going to be looking at organisms, guys. Organisms of all different levels. We're going to look at ourselves as humans. We're going to look at very complex organisms. We're going to look at more simplistic organisms. We're going to be looking at organisms as a whole, and then we're going to be studying how they interact with each other. So how do one set of organisms interact with another set of organisms, but also how do organisms interact with their environment. So it's not simply how organisms interact with each other, but also how do those organisms interact with the things around them that aren't living. And so just as a refresher, I wanted to start by reviewing some levels of organization. We talked about this at the very beginning of the year, and so this should be review for you guys. And I didn't even list all of the levels of organization, just the ones that we're going to be focusing on for this next unit. So if you go all the way back to the beginning of the semester, we talked about molecules and cells and tissues and organs and organ systems all the way up to organisms, right? And then when you go above and beyond that, when you take organisms that are all of the same kind, we call that a species. So that's this first level of organization, a species. So what happens when you take multiple individuals of the same species? Well, you get what we call a population. So a population is a group of the same species living in the same area. Just like we have populations of humans living in cities like Topeka or New York, we have populations of animals living together. You have a population of giraffes or a population of polar bears. The one specific species living together in an area is a population. What happens when we take multiple populations and put them together? We get what's called a community. So a community is defined by having multiple different populations living in the same area. So an example of this could be back to those polar bears. You have a population of polar bears, and then living alongside them, maybe you have a population of sea lions. That's multiple different populations living in one specific area, thus creating what we call a community. And then we get to the ecosystem level. And an ecosystem is made up of all of the communities in a given area. And here's the kicker. An ecosystem also includes all of the non-living parts of the environment. That means the rocks, the water, the dirt are all part of an ecosystem. So this is the first level that you have non-living things in that set of organization or in that level. So an ecosystem includes all of the non-living parts along with those communities. So you have communities in a certain area, but then all of those non-living parts as well. So the rocks, the water, all of those things that those communities require to survive. So then a biome is when you have multiple ecosystems that share something like temperature or some populations of animals that can live in multiple ecosystems would fall under the same biome. And then finally, you have what's called the biosphere. And the biosphere is what we refer to as the planet Earth. It is the entire globe, and it is including the atmosphere that keeps us alive. So it's everything on the entire Earth, including the air that we breathe, is the biosphere. So here's a nice graphic I think that'll help illustrate what I'm talking about. So it goes all the way from individual organism, where you have a species, through a population, and all the way down into the biosphere, which is the part of the Earth containing life, which is the entire Earth. It includes the land, the water, the atmosphere, all of the organisms, and all of the environments present on planet Earth. And so that's where we're going to start with ecology. We're going to start with the biosphere. And we're going to look at how is the biosphere set up, what impacts the biosphere, and how are some of those smaller things like biomes and ecosystems created within this biosphere. Why do we have different biomes or different ecosystems and different organisms on a biosphere? So we're going to take a look at some of those things. So another thing I wanted to discuss today in your first ecology lecture was just how do we study ecology? Um, just like any science, there are multiple ways, or any field of science, there are multiple ways that you can look into and study ecology. Um, the first one, of course, is observation. We've talked a lot about observation all year long, and observation remains in ecology. The first step is asking ecological questions. Those could be simple questions like what species live here. So if I go out into the woods behind my house and I ask that question, what species here, I can make an observation and hopefully determine some of the species that live here. I can ask a follow-up question and then say, well, how many of each species are there? What are the individual numbers of each species? We've got one owl and we've got 7 field mice and we've got 2 deer living in my woods behind my house. Okay, so we can look at individual numbers of species. We can take those questions all the way up and ask much more complex questions. Things like what might happen if I remove a particular species from this community. So if I take the owl out of my backyard community, what might happen to that community? What might happen to the other species? Okay, and it's these types of questions that can lead us into the next phase of studying ecology, which is experimentation. So when we ask those questions, we hopefully then come up with a hypothesis. And then we use experimentation to test those hypotheses. One of the difficult things about ecology is it's such a larger scale. Like I just mentioned, we're talking about the biosphere, which is the entire Earth. It's really hard to experiment on something like the entire Earth. So some ways we can do that are things like using an artificial environment within a lab. So we can set up in a lab temperature probes and oxygen probes and carbon dioxide probes and see photosynthetic rates of plants in a lab, look at productivity, how much do we produce using photosynthesis, how much energy is available in an ecosystem by setting up small controlled experiments. We can also do experiments within a natural ecosystem. And you see a lot of field work in ecology compared to a lot of other fields. And so what they'll do is they'll take out their labware and they'll go out into the field and they'll designate an area in an actual ecosystem and they'll make observations and they'll run tests within an actual ecosystem. Now, the one danger with that is some of the tests that we run can potentially be harmful to an ecosystem. So it's about weighing cost versus benefit. What is the benefit of running this test versus will it be detrimental or possibly detrimental to the ecosystem that we're testing it in? For example, collecting biomass, which is something we'll learn about later on this unit. But to collect biomass, basically biomass is just how much weight do we have of living things. In order to do that, you have to collect the living things, so removing trees and leaves and all of those things could be detrimental to that ecosystem. So it's really difficult to do that in a natural ecosystem. So there are several ways that they attempt to do those things without being harmful to the ecosystem. And then modeling. Like I just mentioned, due to some of those issues that we have with experimentation, we have gained incredible insights by modeling. And so we will build models of the Earth's atmosphere or of the Earth's oceans and look at how ocean currents function based on a small scale model that we can build in a lab. Or we can look at things like the effects of global warming on an ecosystem by modeling it in a smaller scale. And so modeling is incredibly important in ecology. And so on that note, here's an initial model that we've sort of created discussing the biosphere and looking at things that can change the biosphere, how do those systems work on the Earth. So you see right there in the middle, you see this circle and you see the biosphere over here. That is discussing all of the living organisms and the environments that they live in. You've got the atmosphere, which includes all of the gases that surround the Earth. You've got the hydrosphere, which consists of all of the fresh and seawater, including water vapor present on the Earth. And then the geosphere, which is all the solid stuff. So rocks, continents, the ocean floor, um, if you dive deep down into the Earth, you can have portions of the geosphere that are liquid. You've got magma within the Earth's center. Um, and it looks like the very bottom of that slide got cut off, and I apologize for that. But all that says is that deep within the geosphere there are liquids. So we're looking at sort of how these things interact with one another, how we can measure those interactions, and how those overall systems work. And so I think that's where we're going to stop today, guys. In our next lecture, we'll pick up in the biosphere, and we're going to start by discussing the difference between climate and weather and sort of how both of those things form within our planet. So we're going to be looking at a large scale, the entire globe, and how do things like weather or climates form, how do they change, and how do humans interact with those things. So that's it for today. Thank you.